I want to talk about more than the Ozark Jubilee. I want them to appreciate the music community that's been in Springfield since radio started in the 30s, all the way to the present day. My book ends with Wayne Carson and Always on My Mind in the 80s, and Si died in 94. Wayne died. I don't want that to die in Springfield. I want everybody to know about the history in Springfield and don't think of it as just a one moment. I want them to sense their heritage and keep it going.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Dr. Kitty Ledbetter. Kitty has worn a lot of hats in her life. Earlier in her career, she was a radio disc jockey here in Springfield. In fact, the first female country music disc jockey here. After that, she worked in radio stations in Texas, Louisiana, and North Carolina. Later, she earned a Ph.D. in English and taught for 24 years at Texas State University. While there, she wrote a series of books about the lives of 19th century Victorian women in England. But her latest book brings her back to Springfield and country music. The book is called Broadcasting the Ozarks, Si Siman and Country Music at the Crossroads. It is co-written by Kitty and Simon's son, Scott Siman, who is a country music executive in Nashville. Welcome, Kitty.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You have to forgive me, because you're an English teacher, particularly professor, I should say. I wanted to give you a T.S. Eliot quote and ask you to respond to it.
Oh, wrong century.
He says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
Boy, that almost makes me cry.
The reason I bring that up, isn't that a little bit about what you're doing?
It's exactly what's happened since I retired.
Yeah, so...
And I would come home to see my folks, and every time I left, I thought, well, I'll never see that town again. And when they passed away in 2001, they passed away 3 weeks apart, and I thought, well, that makes it easy. I'll just leave this place and I'll never come back. And 20 years later...
Well, I want to get to the book in a few minutes, but let's talk about how did you start in radio here in Springfield?
Well, I was 19. I was working at Commerce Bank in Springfield as a credit clerk in the used car department, so car dealers would call me for a credit report. And my cousin came up to my desk and said, KTTS is hiring a copywriter. And I had no idea what a copywriter was, but I didn't want to work at the bank anymore. And so I picked up the phone after she left. I got the last interview for the day, and I got the job, and my cousin never spoke to me again.
Because?
Because I got the job, and she didn't.
Yeah, I see.
I had the last interview for the day. By the time she got back to her desk, she worked there at the bank. She couldn't get in.
Were you a big fan of country music in those days?
No, I hated country music, but I had been in Texas briefly before I worked at Commerce Bank, and I had been to these cowboy bars in Texas where they have the beer bottle in their back pocket and they dance around in circles.
And sawdust on the floor.
Got fascinated with that whole thing, so I came back a country fan, whereas before, every time Porter Wagoner came on TV, I just thought, ew, let's watch Jackie Gleason or something. So yeah. I became a fan. That's the first way. And then also Barefoot Bob Kinney worked at KTTS, and he and I became really good buddies. He named me Miss Kitty, and he educated me on the history of country music.
How did you get into actually spinning records?
Well, I was in my copywriting desk and writing commercials, and the FCC passed down some kind of order to radio stations to start putting women on the radio. And so Don Paul came up to my office and said, hey, how'd you like to be on the air? And I said, sure. I mean, I was 20 years old. I didn't know anything about it.
Was there any sort of stage fright with it? Or
well, he put me on FM. Nobody listened to FM then.
Oh, okay.
So that's where I got to train on the air. And I had 2 hours a day. That's how I started. And then also doing my copywriter job in the office. But later I got a full-time shift.
I always thought it would be difficult to just talk, like you're carrying on a conversation with yourself. I wondered, do you put some notes together, or does it just kind of come to you, or a stream of consciousness when you're doing that stuff?
Well, you get better as you go along. At first you get scared because you don't know how to run the equipment and you've got a certain amount of time and it's
Would you
scary.
get call-ins in those days?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's before anybody thought about writing anything down as far as liner notes.
Uh-huh.
Later it was simpler, but not as much fun. But at the first, we had a format, and, you just come into the record, say that was so-and-so, and then you push the next button. It got pretty easy.
How long were you here in Springfield doing that?
Well, I worked here 3 different times during the 70s.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I started in January 73, a year after KTTS went country, and I worked there the last time in 1981. And from there, I went to Houston to work at a radio station in Houston. And then I went to Europe for a year, and then I went to another station in Shreveport, and on and on and on. There's a...
You've got to have sort of a wanderlust.
I've got very much so.
What made you decide that you wanted to teach English at the university?
I always wanted to teach when I was a little kid. I used to have a bulletin board, and I would stick things up there like they do construction paper things. I wanted to be an English professor, but I was an average student and thought I would never be able to do it. But when I came back from Europe, I made a list of things that I thought I could do, a dream list. And at the bottom of the list was I always wanted to be an English professor. And so I did all the other things on the list. And at the bottom of the list, I was in North Carolina working in radio, and they had a graduate school there. And I thought, well, I'll just see if I can do that. And I just started and went ahead on a PhD, which was in Columbia, south of Charlotte, because I could work on the air and then drive down to Columbia also for my PhD program. And then I just got out and got a job, and was doing it all the way until 2021 when I retired.
You wrote several books about the lives of women in Victorian England, and I'll come back to that, but I do want to get to the book that we're going to talk about today, Broadcasting in the Ozarks. How did that come to be?
I got home after retiring and wanting to move back to the Ozarks, and it was during COVID. Just as they shut the borders, we were moving into our house up here. When COVID came, and I was bored and wanted to do something and didn't want to retire just to sit around and watch TV, and I thought, what project could I do? And I looked around, and there was a need for something about Si Siman. I mean, a lot had been written and done about the Ozark Jubilee, but what was the story with Si Siman, who was the executive producer of the Ozark Jubilee? So I started digging and decided to do a book on Si.
And how did you reach out to his son, Scott?
Well, I put together, like an academic does, a full list of everything I'd ever done in my whole life and proposed myself as an author for the biography, hoping that they would share their archives with me. And I sent one to Janie, his sister, who lives here in town, Janie Chowning, and I sent one to Scott. And Janie was the one that really pushed the book. She talked Scott into letting me do it. But by surprise, Scott said, well, you can do it if I can be your co-author.
I see.
So I thought, I've never worked with a co-author. Once I did, but I wasn't sure about that, but it was a good thing. And we've had a lot of fun with it and really enjoyed it, and he's helped me a lot.
How long did it take to write it?
About 2 years.
I've interviewed a couple of authors in the past, and some people write from sort of an outline form. They know where the book's going to end before they start, and other folks just start and keep going. What was your style in this book?
Well, it's hard to say because I had just this admiration of Si, and you can't write an academic book admiring somebody to the degree that I admired Si because it seems to not objective enough. But I wrote it anyway, and Brooks Blevins intervened. The great Brooks Blevins said, I want that book for the University of Arkansas Press.
I see.
And he took me on and coached me through it. And if it hadn't been for him, the book never would have been written.
So did you write one chapter and Scott the other, or how did that work?
Scott wrote parts of chapter 1, which is about the baseball career of Si when he was a bat boy for the Springfield Cardinals. Huh? And he wrote also the last chapter, most of the last chapter, which was Si's experience as a music publisher.
What did you discover in the book that was of most interest to you in writing it?
The most fun for me, I guess, would be the 1940s radio in Springfield before television, especially one particular year in 1949 and 1950 when a lot of really famous musicians that I admire converged on Springfield and lived here and worked on KWTO. and Chet Atkins, Homer and Jethro, the Carter family. There was a guitar player named Roy Lanham who ended up playing with the Sons of the Pioneers. He was their second and last guitar player in their whole career. A group called the Whippoorwills. They were all in Springfield, living in Springfield for about a year. And that 1 year, it was really interesting to me that so much talent could be here in Springfield at one time.
Well, there had to be something magical in the water that made that phenomenon to occur here. How do you account for it?
Well, KWTO was
Ralph Foster, or
KWTO and Ralph Foster were interested and did country music, live country music, and it had 5,000 watts, so it had a good listening area. It also had mutual broadcasting, so it was coast to coast. And, they were on a trail of radio stations that were doing barn dance style radio with country music. So there were lots of cities, and musicians would go from city to perform. And KWTO just seemed to be a spot that attracted a lot of people. They gave them a lot of rare airtime. They gave them road gigs that they could make extra money on according to their shows. It was just a hot spot. And it was on Route 66. It was easy to go from Chicago to L.A. and stop and play.
That didn't hurt.
It's exactly what Les Paul did back in the early 30s. He lived here and worked here.
So a lot of the shows were broadcast live early on, weren't they?
All the shows were broadcast live.
Yeah.
There was no tape.
Tell me about Scott Simon. Tell me about the person that you've profiled here in your book. Excuse me, I meant Si.
I could talk about Scott, too. But
he's still alive, Let's
Yeah. Well, Si attracted me because he's just an amazing human being. He was an entrepreneur, and he had his hands in so many things, even as a little kid. He was selling popsicles when he was 8 years old out of a little cart. He was a bat boy for the Springfield Cardinals. He was a driver for St. Louis Cardinals talent scout Charlie Barrett. He was booking bands, jazz bands, big bands in the Shrine Mosque when he was still in high school. And he just had this long career of entrepreneurship. He owned the wrestling franchise at the Shrine Mosque for a long time. And then after the war, he just showed up on Foster's doorstep and said, "Okay, I'm done with that. Let me back in," and just worked just about any job he could in the radio station for the rest of his career. And took charge. He was one of those guys that just has great ideas, and he was always positive and always had some kind of saying that could guide you through life. So he was just a really wonderful personality.
Do you think if he were here today, he would attribute his success to anything more than hard work? Maybe the people that knew and helped him? Do you have any opinion about that?
He owed a lot to Ralph Foster and never failed to credit Ralph Foster. That's why Scott is named Scott Foster Simon.
Right.
He's named after Uncle Ralph. They still call him Uncle Ralph. Janie does too. They never Mr. Foster.
Oh, interesting.
So Si credited Foster for giving him his career, and Si just worked at it to make it happen. Everything happened. Chet Atkins used to say he was the live wire in Springfield, and that was exactly what he was. Everything he did, he just made it happen. He was like an electrical charge.
Why do you think he was so successful in recruiting talent?
I think he knew a good thing when he saw it. He knew a good song. He said he didn't know everything, and there was some that he didn't know were going to be hits, but he knew a good thing when he saw it. He knew talent. And he took advantage of it, and he helped people. He helped them get record contracts. I mean, when he saw Chet Atkins, first thing he did was change Chet's name from Chester to Chet. And Chet loved that because he was kind of a lonely kid, had an inferiority complex, and here comes Si, booming in, telling him he's the greatest guitar player in the world, and we're going to name you Chet. And he loved that because nobody had ever given him a nickname before. So Si was that kind of a character. He wasn't afraid of anything. He just charged in. Well, let's see what's best, and he just made it happen.
That's amazing. Now, wasn't John Mahaffey working with him?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about John Mahaffey.
They had a partnership in a corporation called Radiozark. And before Radiozark, one of the first things they did was start a publishing company. And John Mahaffey was partnership with Si in the publishing company called Earl Barton Music. And so Si's middle name is Earl, and Mahaffey's middle name is Barton. And so they combined the names and made Earl Barton Music.
So tell our listeners about the Ozark Jubilee and the impact it had on country music.
Oh, gosh. It put Springfield on the map. It became a phenomenon for several years. From 1955 to 1960, Springfield was the center of the universe for country music, and every trade publication said so, that Springfield was the new Nashville. Springfield was the place where things were happening, and artists who would be on the road thought that once you made it to Springfield, you had it made. And so Springfield really overshadowed Nashville for several years.
Why didn't that continue? Why did it die away?
Well, the television show, the Ozark Jubilee, died away eventually, and the artists sort of filtered out into other opportunities after that. And really didn't go away for a while because Branson is a result of the Ozark Jubilee.
Well, that's true. I hadn't thought of it from
Sure.
that perspective.
That's when all the shows started up down on the Strip down there, and it was the Strip then. It's also interesting that Don Richardson, who was the writer for the Ozark Jubilee, helped start Silver Dollar City and, in fact, named Silver Dollar City.
What do you hope that people will take away from your book?
Oh, I want to talk about more than the Ozark Jubilee. I want them to appreciate the music community that's been in Springfield since radio started in the 30s all the way to the present day. My book ends with Wayne Carson and Always on My Mind in the 80s, and Si died in 94. Wayne died. I don't want that to die in Springfield. I want everybody to know about the history in Springfield and don't think of it as just a one moment. I want them to sense their heritage and keep it going.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Jeff Kessinger. I'm the Reader Engagement Editor for the Springfield Daily Citizen. A day in the life of the Reader Engagement Editor starts around 8 a.m., getting the newsletters, SGF AM, all ready to go, making sure the forecast is up to date for you, and gathering links from other news organizations. After that, I spend a few hours on social media. I have to schedule our posts, have to check the comments and make sure everybody's behaving nicely. In the afternoon, I usually turn my attention to editing some of our freelance contributors, and I also do some reporting of my own on arts and culture happenings. Springfield has a great arts community, musicians, visual artists, performance artists. It's important that we give back to the arts community and thank them for the color that they add to our community and to our world. And so by reporting on events that are happening or coming up, I'm helping people find ways to connect with the artists around here.
Is there another book on the horizon?
Well, we'll see. Right now I'm working on an academic book that doesn't seem very interesting after doing this one for sure.
In doing some research, now we are a family program here, but I was reading some articles and I was surprised to learn that Mark Twain wrote some pretty racy stuff early in his career. A book called 1601. That affected you. Tell us a little bit about the book and how that affected you.
Where did you get that information?
I have my sources.
Well, I wrote a college paper about it back when I was at then Southwest Missouri State. I don't know if I can say this. The story that he wrote that fascinated me was called The Mammoth Cod.
Okay.
So I just thought, wow, Mark Twain is not just for little boys, it's for big boys too. And it was interesting that he was such a scandalous writer, really. He had dark days, and he wrote about them. Uh-huh. And I like an author who's varied like that and has a lot of texture, and he certainly did come out. He wrote a lot of pornography.
I didn't know that. It reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with an author that has nowhere the notoriety of Mark Twain, but his name was Lawrence Block. Mm. And he's written a lot of detective novels, but he's been writing for probably more than 50 years. But he started off writing kind of racy stuff back in the early 50s. It's interesting how people get their start. But anyway, that sort of led to you writing about Victorian women. How did that occur?
Well, I don't know how Mark Twain had anything to do with that.
No,
but
well, thank you for clearing that up. But it was interesting to me.
That was 30
and certainly
or 40
the Victorian women wouldn't own up to it if he did, would
right.
they?
I'm kind of like Si. I take advantage of opportunities. And in academia right now, and has been for the last 40 years, if you don't write about race, class, or gender, you're not going to get published. And if you don't get published, you're not going to get a job if you're a PhD.
Okay.
And I wanted to get a job, and of course I'm aggressively active in everything that I do. It's a burden. But I forced my way into a PhD program at the University of South Carolina and started publishing immediately and tried to find out the niches in each of the areas that were okay to publish in and started writing about women writers, but women writers in Victorian periodicals. So it went with my interest in journalism and writing and broadcasting, except it was Victorian periodicals. That's something that they weren't writing about very much. In fact, I was collecting rare books, and I would go into rare bookstores and I would say, do you have any women writers in here? And somebody actually told me that women weren't writing in the 19th century. And that was absurdly false.
Well, that wasn't my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But book dealers, you would think. So I decided to just write about women for a while, and that's what I did, except for a Tennyson book that I wrote. Mm-hmm. And that was by fluke. I wrote it in a graduate school paper, and 10 years later I was looking for something to write for my first academic job and picked this paper up and wrote a book around it. And everybody had written about Tennyson as the poet laureate for 50 years, but no one had written anything about the poetry as it appeared in a periodical. So he wrote volumes, and that's where they would start talking about him in volumes. But what I wanted to do was, where was it originally published? It was published in a newspaper. He was very active with newspaper reading and writing about what he was reading. And so a lot of his poetry was taken from themes that he saw in the newspapers, like the Charge of the Light Brigade, and all the context that on a paper, you turn the pages and there are all these other stories, there are images, graphic design, that influences your reading of the poem. And that seemed to be a new idea to people, that anything that was on the page of a newspaper would influence the poem that he would write. So that's kind of where I went from there.
How would a 19th century upper middle class Victorian woman describe success for her own self?
Well, it just depends on the woman. I mean, really, a lot of women were still engaged
They had pretty confined roles, more or less, didn't they?
Some of them did. There were choices, though, a lot more choices than people knew, and writing was one of their ways out. Another way out of the home was philanthropy. So a lot of the ideology that's sort of enmeshed with domesticity and religion, which was the right side of the fence that they needed to be on, philanthropy got them out of the house and into the world for the good causes, but it gave them opportunities to see what the other part of the world we're living in. So also, just writing for newspapers let them be businesswomen. Some of them owned newspapers, and the domestic act of needlework could bring them into a business world too, because they sold patterns. They edited women's periodicals with patterns in them. So there were a lot of things going on that people don't realize. They weren't quite as confined as
they weren't as stereotypical as you might think.
No.
Probably shame on me. I don't know.
Well, it's typical. That's what I'm here for.
Tell us a little bit about the banjo and bass. What's that?
Bass.
Thank you.
I play bass.
We are in Bass Pro country.
Right, you just can't get away from it. My husband, Alan Mundy, is a famous banjo player. He's the 2021 Steve Martin Banjo Prize winner, and he's in the American Banjo Hall of Fame. And so he and I play together sometimes. We would play as banjo and bass. And we didn't have to be a fancy gig. We just went to cafes and played out there in cafes. So that's what that's about.
Do you have some upcoming performances?
We don't, but he does. He's going to be playing at the Ozark Historium next Wednesday. I'm there showing off quilts, and he's there showing off his banjo. So it's 10 o'clock next Wednesday at the Ozark Historium in Gainesville.
I'd like to ask you, who are your personal heroes?
Oh, gosh.
Or heroines?
Everybody's a hero to me that doesn't sit around and watch TV all the time, especially when we age. I'm 71. I never thought that I'd be active like this at this age, but I feel like I've just gotten started. So to me, I want to look at people who are busy doing things instead of sitting around.
Right.
I just hate that.
Well, I want to remind our listeners that the book, I didn't ask you, when's it coming out?
Well, I'd like to know. I just finished reading the proofs today, but my press says probably January, but could be December.
Okay. The book, again, is Broadcasting the Ozarks, Si Siman and Country Music at the Crossroads. Kitty, thank you for being my guest.
Thank you.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/innertown or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.